Many orchestrators have trouble conceiving of the piano as a physical instrument. They think of the piano as a kind of bland electric keyboard that can play anything, just like the piano electronically simulated inside a computer. They act as if the piano is not a real thing, a physical, idiosyncratic, acoustical instrument. The piano is, however, a physical construction, a musical instrument with strengths and weaknesses. It's a widely held belief that a non-pianist cannot write a sophisticated piano part, one that takes full advantage of the piano's true technique. This is because sophisticated, idiomatic piano music is orchestrated. It takes into consideration the effect of chord voicing, register, texture, and figuration, just like a well-orchestrated ensemble piece. It takes advantage of the piano's physical properties. Non-pianists rarely understand the piano's physical properties. The composer Hector Berlioz did. He wrote that the piano should be, quote, regarded as a small independent orchestra in itself. The pianoforte must have its own appropriate instrumentation, which is closely connected with the pianist's art. I call this pianistic art pianostration. The basic techniques of freezing and activation are regularly used in piano music. Activations such as these might be manifested as broken octaves, Beethoven's Opus 2, number 1, arpeggiated chords, Beethoven's Opus 2, number 2, or trills, Beethoven's Opus 2, number 1, movement number 3. Freezing is found in Beethoven's Opus 10, number 3, first movement, and in the bass of Opus 10, number 3, movement 3. Timbral change on the piano can best be achieved through a change of register. The timbre of the piano's low register is drastically different from the notes of the piano's high range. Chord voicing also affects timbre. The timbre of a closely voiced chord is different from one where the chord's pitches are spread out. Here are a variety of different yet effective chord voicings. The first voicing, my all-time favorite, appears in the slow movement of the Saint-Saëns Piano Concerto No. 5. The fifth and third of the chord appear an octave above the root. These upper notes are played very softly and sound almost like overtones rather than real notes. This produces a beautiful bell-like effect. Piano pedagogue Joseph Gatt described the basic technique of playing the piano as a kind of swing stroke. Gatt taught that the best way to control the downward motion of the key was not to press the key straight down, but rather to swing the entire arm into the key. Using the swing stroke makes it easier to control when the key reaches the escapement point, the point where the hammer is fired toward the string. This makes the playing more accurate and the tone of the piano more beautiful. Much of the effort of the modern pianist is exerted in producing a beautiful tone. This means controlling the attack of the sound. The swing stroke reduces noise on the attack, making the sustained portion of the sound proportionately louder and more beautiful. The sustain of the sound is accomplished simply by keeping the finger on the key, holding it down to keep the damper off the string. Not all piano music can be played using the swing stroke. Fast passages, for example, require the movements of the individual fingers. Like string players, pianists have to shift the position of the hand. It's only possible to play 5 notes without shifting the hand to one side or the other. Since shifting complicates piano technique, beginning piano music is sometimes written so that it can be played without shifting. using only 5-finger technique. Stravinsky wrote a set of pieces of this type. Notice how the hand itself barely moves as the piece is played. Scales and arpeggios are basic to any pianist technique. It's a cliche that any time we hear a pianist practicing, what we hear is scales or arpeggios. Yet, these figurations are so basic to pianistic technique that pianists do actually spend an inordinate amount of time practicing them. The difficulty of scales and arpeggios involves shifting hand position. Shifting position on the piano becomes more difficult as the interval of the shift increases, and as the pianist attempts to accomplish the shift smoothly, without a break in the sound. When playing scales and arpeggios, the pianist wants the change in position to be inaudible. To accomplish this, the pianist pulls the thumb under the hand as the other fingers play their ascending scale notes. This allows the thumb to be ready to play the next note after the last finger has depressed its key. This is an extremely complex motion and is difficult to do convincingly. This is why pianists practice scales and arpeggios so diligently. And in slow motion. These same kinds of movements are used in playing arpeggios. They are exaggerated because the notes of the arpeggios are further apart than the notes of the scales. And in slow motion. There are a number of special techniques used in piano playing. These are much like the special techniques used by string players, pizzicato, double stops, and so on. No composer would write a double stop for the violin without taking into consideration the special technique that was required to play it. Yet, pianists routinely write passages for the piano as if all passages are equally playable. It is valuable for the orchestrator to consider the different sounds the different techniques produce, and to treat them almost as if they were separate instruments. It's practical to think of these techniques as building blocks of pianostration. Staccato is probably the most common of the special techniques used by pianists. It is produced primarily by an abrupt vertical movement of the forearm. This produces not only a shorter note, but also a different timbre, a kind of popping sound akin to pizzicato. Staccato can be applied to notes, dyads, or chords. There's a physical limit as to how fast staccato notes can be played. This is based on the limitations of the vertical movement of the arm. Staccato symbols should be marked in the score when the staccato sound is desired. Octaves are commonly used in piano music. These are generally produced using the swing stroke, so the octave's timbre is just a thickening at the octave of the piano's basic sound. When playing octaves, the hand and fingers remain rigid. Pianists change pitch when playing octaves by moving the entire hand up and down the keyboard. This locking of the position of the fingers allows orchestrators to write parallel octaves, sevenths, sixths, even parallel ninths. Pianists will play these less common intervals using the more familiar technique of playing octaves. It is possible to lock more than 2 fingers in place. Pianists are often asked to play planing chords using this technique. Playing repeated notes rapidly on the piano requires a special technique. The swing stroke used in standard playing produces too large a movement to be repeated rapidly. Short passages of repeated notes can be played by the forearm, staccato, but this cannot be sustained for long due to fatigue. Pianists generally alternate fingers when long passages of repeated notes are called for. One finger can be preparing to strike while the other is already on the key. This produces smoother, more rapid repetitions. Orchestrators don't need to include any special markings or fingerings for this effect, but they should be aware that because two or more fingers are involved, the other fingers of the hand are less available to play additional notes. Pianists sometimes achieve a rapid repetition of pitches using both hands. This works well for the repetition of adjacent pitches as well as for repeating the same notes. It's customary for the composer to indicate which hand plays which note. This is done by placing the stems up on the right-hand notes and down for the left-hand notes. This may be clarified by using the abbreviations RH for the right hand and LH for the left hand. Trills and tremolos produce similar results, yet are played using different techniques. The tremolo is accomplished by a rotation of the wrist. The trill is generally done with the fingers, although rotation of the wrist is sometimes involved. Trills and tremolos make excellent activations. These effects require multiple fingers. It's difficult to use them in conjunction with other figures in the same hand. A special application of the tremolo to octave technique produces something called broken octaves. This was a favorite effect of many classical era composers. Dyad scales, like scales and thirds, are an advanced technique. Scales and thirds are common, but somewhat problematic. They are difficult to play smoothly and quickly because the pianist keeps running out of fingers. When playing standard scales, pianists are able to move the thumb under the hand to reset the hand position while the other fingers continue the scale. When playing thirds, the pianist is forced to lift the hand every 2 or 3 notes. The composer can choose to articulate the passage to accommodate this lifting, or he can hope that the pianist has sufficient experience with this technique to bring it off smoothly. In any case, it should be noted that there is a practical limit as to how fast such scales can be played. It is possible to modify a musical passage to make it easier to play. Fast octave scales can be made easier by dropping out the bottom note of the octave on every other note. This allows the hand to kind of walk down the keyboard. A similar modification can be made to scales and thirds. While these types of modifications can work well, pianists sometimes find it easier to play the traditional version of the technique, the version they have already practiced and perfected. Glissandos are a somewhat underused effect. They are performed with a special technique where the hand is turned sideways, allowing the player to run the top of the fingernail across the keys. Glissandos produce an extremely rapid succession of notes. They may be performed on the white keys, producing a diatonic scale, or on the black keys, producing a pentatonic scale. Composers have even called for glissandos in thirds and octaves. Beethoven is said to have used a glissando in octaves in the last movement of his Waldstein Sonata. This glissando technique allowed Beethoven to play a scale faster than was possible with the fingers. Glissandos are extensively used in harp music for activation. Glissandos in the piano can be used as a substitute for harp glissandos, or they can be used to reinforce harp glissandos. Pianos generally have 3 pedals. The rightmost pedal is the sustain pedal. The sustain pedal holds all of the dampers off of the strings, allowing any struck note to sound as long as the pedal is held down. This can be problematic. If the pedal's already depressed when a note is struck, strings other than the one struck will vibrate sympathetically. This causes extraneous noises associated with the attack of the sound to be sustained. Pianists are usually careful to depress the pedal after a note has been struck, to maintain a beautiful tone and to minimize unwanted noises. Student orchestrators often call for the pedal to be held down for long periods of time. This creates a blurred, mysterious effect, but it also amplifies unwanted noises and should be used with caution. Pianists will often use the pedal to facilitate the performance of any score, but if orchestrators want it used in specific ways, it should be marked. Orchestrators should carefully mark not only when the pedal is depressed, but also when it is released. The piano can achieve beautiful sustained effects with or without the pedal. It's more precise to control sustain by holding down individual keys. This works well as long as the orchestrator takes into account that a pianist cannot use the fingers holding the sustained notes for anything else, and that the hand cannot move up or down the keyboard if it's sustaining a note. This can be used to the pianist's advantage. The sustained note can be used to anchor the hand in position and makes playing the other notes in the passage more secure. When it's impossible to sustain individual notes with the hand, the sostenuto pedal can be used. The sostenuto pedal is the middle pedal on many, but not all pianos. To use it, the pianist first depresses the note she wishes to sustain, then depresses the sostenuto pedal. The sostenuto pedal works well for sustaining pedal points and freeing up the hands to play other notes. Some pianists never use the sostenuto pedal. Their justifications range from the fact that the pedal is not included on all pianos to the unreliable nature of its mechanism. Sostenuto effects, especially resonance effects, can be very subtle. These effects don't always sound as good to the audience as they do to the pianist. These resonance effects can be lost entirely in a reverberant hall. A typical piano piece from the classical period has what is essentially a two-voice texture. Occasionally extra notes are added to accentuate a particular place in the music or to thicken the texture to cadence. These extra notes come and go at the whim of the composer. They should not be considered independent voices, but rather temporary additions to the basic two-part texture. This coming and going of extra parts seems to contradict what is often taught in basic music theory classes, that a four-voice texture should be maintained at all times. Maintaining four parts in a piano piece is difficult. Pianists only have 10 fingers, and maintaining four voices requires 2.5 fingers per voice. That doesn't leave many fingers to accomplish the independent movement of each voice. A common objection to the practice of arbitrarily adding or subtracting voices from a musical texture is that having such sudden textural changes is startling for the audience. The idea is that the audience is following each voice and will be distressed if a voice suddenly appears or disappears. I believe that most audiences hardly notice this phenomenon. On the contrary, the addition of extra voices can clarify musical intent rather than confounding it. Piano music with more than two real voices must be planned with care. Orchestrators should make sure that the hand playing the multiple voices has enough fingers to play them, and that the fingers can physically stretch enough to reach the highest and lowest notes. Extreme versions of multi-voice writing were once considered extended techniques. The 19th century virtuoso Sigismund Thalberg invented a technique he called third hand technique. This technique added an additional musical line to the standard two-part pianistic texture. This additional line seemed as if it would require a third hand to play it. In Thalberg's Fantasy on Rossini's Moses, the left hand plays the bass. The right hand plays the eighth notes on the top and bottom of the treble clef staff. The third hand is the melody, in dotted half notes, in the middle of the treble clef part. Writing a piano part is really a design problem. The designer's task is to realize her musical intent in a way that sounds good and that is idiomatic for the instrument. This can be done by keeping in mind the basic techniques already described, or it can be done by studying existing piano music and extracting from it modules, musical gestures that can be combined at the whim of the orchestrator. Here's a fairly trivial example. The example takes modules from a Beethoven sonata and uses them, with a few alterations, to create a version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star in the style of Beethoven. The figures in the first few measures needed little alteration before being used in the new Twinkle version. Measures 7 and 8 seem to work better directly after the opening statement of the Twinkle melody, so I moved them. The passage in ascending thirds needed to be expanded in order to fit the Twinkle motive. First, I'll play the original Beethoven, then the new Twinkle version. This Twinkle variation is almost guaranteed to work musically. It's also guaranteed to be playable, as idiomatic for the player as the original Beethoven. While this example is somewhat superficial, even silly, the idea of using modules of material from existing works is sound, and it's a great way to learn to orchestrate. Imaginative orchestrators need not produce such superficial results if they use these modules in new and imaginative ways.